Welcome to Mode Bespoke, I'm Atenas. For today's tutorial, we're going to talk about how to adjust the width on your Tunisian crochet projects. So let's get started. Last week, I had posted the tutorial for Dylan's blanket. And for this blanket, we used the lattice stitch, and this is a Tunisian lattice stitch. And in the tutorial, I told you that this was what I call a shrinking stitch. Now, a shrinking stitch is, at least what I call it, any stitch that you begin with an initial chain. So let's say our initial chain is 10 inches. And when you start working on several rows of your fabric, you end up realizing that the width of your project is no longer 10 inches, but let's say 8 inches. So it shrank your initial chain. So that's what I call a shrinking stitch. Now there are several reasons why a Tunisian stitch can shrink. The first one is the stitch itself. There are some stitches that, because of how you have to combine different vertical stitches together, it might shrink a little bit. The second reason has to do with tension. So whether you cast on really tightly or you work a really tight return pass, that will affect the width of your work. The last reason has to do with your hook. Now if you're using a larger hook than what is recommended for your size yarn, you will have some amount of shrinkage in the stitch, and that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you're using a Tunisian simple stitch or the lattice stitch or a honeycomb stitch. Any stitch will shrink if you use a larger hook. So today I'm going to teach you how to calculate a shrink rate, which you can then use to resize any Tunisian crochet project or to write any of your own Tunisian projects. So if you're going to be using a wider hook than what is recommended for your yarn, you'll be able to use this shrink rate to calculate your initial chain so that the width of your project is the width that you want the final project to be. So let's start with a sample. So we're going to have to make a small swatch. And generally what I do with my swatch is I make a minimum of 4" by 4" square. In centimeters, that's a 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter square. You can use a larger sample if you want, so you can make an initial chain that's longer than that, but I wouldn't go anything smaller than a 4". That way you can get a better idea of just what your shrink rate is. Anything smaller than that, say you make a 2" sample, it's going to be a little too small and you won't get an accurate read on what your shrink rate really is. So use a minimum of 4. So we're going to make an initial chain that's at least 4" wide. Now, when crocheting your sample, I highly recommend that you use the same yarn, if possible, that you plan to use for your project. So for the Dylan blanket, which is the sample we're using, or the example I should say, that we're using for today's tutorial, I used this yarn. Now this is a medium worsted yarn, and the pattern calls for a 10 millimeter Tunisian hook. So I've got the same yarn and I've got the same hook that I intend to use for the blanket pattern. We're also going to be using the same stitch. So we're using the lattice stitch for the blanket. So our sample is going to be crocheted in the lattice stitch. And we're going to have to keep in mind multiples if your stitch has any. So if you're using just a Tunisian simple stitch and you don't have to use a multiple of anything, then you can just make it 4" wide. The lattice stitch is a multiple of 4 plus 3 for the blanket, because remember we're resizing the blanket in this example. So my blanket pattern calls for multiples of 4 plus 3. So that's what we're gonna use. So let's begin with the slip knot. And I've already taught you how to make the lattice stitch in 2 other tutorials, so I'm not gonna go over the stitch. We are, however, gonna go over the process. So, like I said, we're gonna need to make a chain in multiples of 4 plus 3, because that's what our pattern calls for. So I'm just gonna start with multiples of 4. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. Then I'll do another one. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then plus 3. So here are my multiples of 4. I made 12, and then plus 3. And now we're going to measure our chain. So just looking at it, it looks like it might be over 4". So I'm just going to stop here. We're going to measure this, and our chain is 4.5 inches across. So from here to here is 4.5 inches. That's over the minimum of 4" that I wanted to make for my swatch, so we're good. Now I'm going to work on the stitch. So you're going to follow the same steps you need for whatever stitch you're working on. So for the lattice stitch, I'm going to start working the first, the foundation row, first and second rows of my stitch. So you're going to make a small sample using this stitch. So I'm going to start casting on. I'll make a small sample. I'm going to make it about a square, so anywhere between like the 4 to 4.5 inch mark, just to make a square swatch. So let me get that started. I'll come back as soon as my swatch is ready and we'll go from there. Once you've worked several rows and you've ended up with a square, we're going to measure this again. So now the width of our work, or the width of our fabric, is 3.5 inches. So we're going to use this to calculate our shrink rate.
I'm going to take the measurement of our initial chain, which was 4.5 inches. To this, we are going to subtract the 3.5 inches, which was the measurement of the width of our swatch. That's going to give us a difference of 1 inch. Now we're going to take the inch and we're going to divide it by the 4.5, which was the measurement for our initial chain. That's going to give us 0.22, or 22%. This means that the width of your fabric is going to shrink your initial chain by 22%. So now that you have your shrink rate, what do you do with it? So let's take our example here. So we're going to be making another one of these blankets, and let's say we want to resize this blanket. Now, we want to make this blanket 50 inches across. And when I mean the 50 inches across, I mean just from one side of the blanket to the other, and this is not including the border. Because the pattern tells us that this lattice stitch is going to shrink, at least within this pattern, we're going to have to use our shrink rate to calculate how wide we want our initial chain to be in order to have a fabric that measures 50 inches once we've crocheted several rows. So we're going to take the 50 inches, which is what the width that we want our blanket to be, and we're going to multiply that by 1.22. Now the 1.22 is just 1 plus your shrink rate, which in our case was 22%. So 50 times 1.22 gives us 61 inches. This means that our initial chain must measure 61 inches in order for our final project to measure 50 inches across. Once you have calculated the measurement that your initial chain needs to be, which was the 61 inches, you can use that measurement to create your initial chain, keeping in mind that some stitches have multiples. So, like in this example, the lattice stitch uses multiples of 4 plus 3. So keep those multiples in mind while you are crocheting your chain. So then create a chain that measures 61 inches but has been crocheted in multiples of 4 plus 3, and then you'll be able to create the rest of your project just following the instructions on whatever pattern you're working on. And that's it. If you need to see the written instructions for this process, they are available on my website. I'm going to leave in the description box below. Give it a practice, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment here in the comment section, or you can always email me. My email address is also written down in the description box, but let me know what you think. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, go ahead and hit subscribe. I post videos every week. If you want to see any projects here on the channel, you can also leave those down in the comment section. If you want to see more of my work, you can follow me on Instagram. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you all again in the next tutorial.